Hello, welcome back. Today in this lecture, we are going to talk about the second of the three gems in the Buddhist tradition. All right, so let's get started. I am going to share my screen with you now. And there we go. Cool. So let's get into it. So the second gem, recall with me, the first gem in the Buddhist traditions is the Buddha himself. And so in our last lecture, we talked about the birth narrative around the Buddha, the four sights which led to his great departure, and ultimately which lead to his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, in Bodhigoya. Today, we're going to transition from talking about the first gem, talking about the Buddha, and we're going to talk about the second gem, which are the teachings. So let's get started. I hope we can get through this within one lecture to see how it goes. All right. If not, I might make this two lectures. All right. So these are some of the things in terms of overview, what we'll be talking about. Dharma, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the Dhammapada, dependent origination, the three characters of existence, and the Anatman. I could already see, right, in looking at this, that I'm anticipating what we're going to do here is have two lectures on the second gem. And whereas we had one lecture on the Buddha, and we'll have probably one lecture only on the Sangha, the third gem, the community, here I think it might be best if we divide this up into two lectures on the second gem, the Dharma, because there's quite a bit that I want to unpack with you in terms of giving you a summary introduction. So the Four Noble Truths. So first, prior to talking about the Four Noble Truths, let's talk about the term itself, Dharma, within the Buddhist tradition. Dharma in the Hindu tradition means, roughly speaking, duty, to do one's duty. Dharma here is to be understood as that which holds. So a teaching that holds together and holds one together. Dharma is eternal truth. Is eternal truth, meaning a lot of truth is, contingent and shaped by its kind of location, right? And sometimes truth could shift in a way, but eternal truth cannot be touched. It doesn't change. It's constant. It's perfect, and it's transcendent, right? It's not within history. It's above history. It's eternal truth, and these eternal truths are truths about nature and the reality of spiritual forces and moral duty. The Buddhist teachings, as you would expect, are Dharma. They're eternal truth, right? Following the pattern of an Asian sage. Remember, we talked about basic patterns. We talked about Asian sages. Asian sages, what they do is give eternal truth, eternal wisdom. So the teachings of enlightened teachers could also be recognized as Dharma, and one or more of the major Buddhist traditions are vehicles. So, for example, in the Mahayana tradition, there's other Buddhas or Bodhisattvas whose teachings are revered and recognized to be eternal wisdom. All right, so remember we left a story with the Buddha. We left the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, struggling for and praying for enlightenment. Remember, he prays away Mara, the Lord of Death, and an earthquake comes that sends Mara off. And then he remembers that his father found peace in meditation, so he himself returns to meditation and he reaches enlightenment. After reaching enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, the Buddha preached his first sermon in Deer Park. So this is a well-known historical sermon. It's called the First Sermon at Deer Park. And in this sermon, he teaches on some of the most core and essential teachings of the Buddhist tradition. And notably, the Four Noble Truths is one teaching he touches upon, and then the Eightfold Path. And I think that's what we'll talk about today in this lecture, and we might stop there. And so, in terms of the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth is suffering. The truth is that no living being escapes suffering. And the word for suffering here is dukkha. Dukkha. And so it's this kind of being unsatisfied, being left unsatisfied. So, I mean, there's different ways that this term dukkha could be unpacked and understood. But so it often gets simply defined as suffering. What type of suffering is kind of this gnawing, kind of constant sense of not being satisfied. birth, sickness, senility, and death are occasions for suffering, whether it be physical or psychological, any form of suffering, right? And this is the first noble truth, that suffering is a part of life, and that suffering is more or less inescapable in this life, right? It's something that we hold in common. The second noble truth has to do with the origin. And so the question is, if life is suffering, then where does this suffering come from? And the answer is suffering comes from excessive desire. So it's because we want too much, right? We want too much, we desire too much. And because of that, we have a sense of being unsatisfied and of suffering. And so that's the second noble truth. Now, the third and fourth noble truth come after the first and second. The third is that is about the sensation of suffering. So the question is, how does one stop suffering? The answer is in the third noble truth, which states, if suffering is caused by incessant desire, then to stop suffering, one must need to learn to control and cease desiring. That leads to the fourth noble truth. And the fourth noble truth is to put an end to desire, which will put an end to suffering. One must follow these 8 principles of self-improvement, which we'll talk about now, which is known as the Eightfold Path. So the Four Noble Truths, they follow really a lot of Buddhist teachings do this. They follow basically the laws of cause and effect. Like there's a cause and there's an effect. And you see this a lot in Buddhist teaching, right? Because we suffer, what's the cause of our suffering? It's excessive desire. So if we can root out excessive desire by practicing the Eightfold Path, we could decrease our limit and eventually take away our suffering, right? And that's a very much a cause and effect way to understand the nature of truth, the nature of the world. And you see that often within Buddhist teachings, this kind of emphasis on cause and effect. So the Eightfold Path, and by excuse me, and by participating in the Eightfold Path, one will bring an end to suffering. Now, the Eightfold Path is not sequential. Rather, it should be understood like petals on a flower, and how each petal kind of goes to the center, but there's not a sequence to it. There's not a hierarchy. And so this Eightfold Path should be taken as a collective rather than thinking of it in terms of as a hierarchy. And so the Eightfold Path, let's get into it now. It consists of right understanding. So having a right viewpoint on the reality of things, right? Having a right understanding of the world, right thought. So Buddhist teachings focus a lot on what we think creates this kind of reality for us, right? And what we think is powerful. And so we need to be reflective of our thoughts and keep our thoughts in captive, right? And train our thoughts to go in a direction that's builds us up rather than takes us down. Right speech. Like in the Buddhist tradition, there's a recognition that what we say matters, right? That words have power. And of course, words are connected to having right understanding and having right thought. So these things are interconnected, but right speech matters. And that's part of the Eightfold Path. Recognizing that what we say has power, right? Words have power. Right conduct, right? So how we live our lives. Do we live our lives in an ethical way, in an honoring way, right? In a virtuous way. So how we comport ourselves, how we live our lives, it matters. Right livelihood. What type of work do we engage in? Right, work is a major part of our lives. Right, we spend a significant amount of time working to make money. Right livelihood. So thinking about the type of work we do, and is that type of work life-giving, right? Is it something that is like matching our giftings and something that is producing goodness in the world? Right effort. And you see this across the Buddhist tradition that effort is important, right? Upaya, or skillful means, in the Mahayana tradition, gets emphasized. for example, having right effort, right mindfulness. It kind of is connected to right thoughts. Being in a proper state of mind, stealing the mind, getting rid of the clutter which distracts us from the mind through meditation. A lot of these Buddhist traditions, they have different forms of meditation which they teach, right, and which people practice. So right mindfulness, which comes through that stillness through meditation, and that leads to right meditation. Right meditation is the eighth. So these things you could see, I hope that they're interconnected, right? And there's no hierarchy to them. And bringing these things together and following these things together, being mindful of these things and practicing them, these things are what lead to a decreasing of suffering and hopefully the end of suffering and produce greater enlightenment in one's life. So again, just to kind of restate that right understanding, right? To understand that all is subject, for example, to ceasing, to understand this law beyond a cognitive recognition, but as the only reality is the goal of right understanding. So not just to understand it conceptually, but more so like, deeper within in a profound way, right? That's right understanding. One of the eight within the Eightfold Path. Again, the second of the Eightfold Path we talked about is right thought. Right thought has to do with being free from sensuous desire, or ill will or cruelty towards others, right? Being free of the kind of the desires of the body, yeah, is connected to right thought. Like having purity in thought, for example. I mentioned that one of the Eightfold Path is right speech, and speech is connected to mental formations, karma, and our speech produces karma, right? So speech produces karma. So speech, remember, karma means action, and speech is a action, right? It's a type of action that we engage in. And we talked about having right livelihood, right? Vocation, and it varies, right? I mean, there's a whole range of different vocations one might pursue, from finding their giftings fit well within the business world, or working in agriculture, or working in the medical field. Certainly, we need good doctors and medical practitioners, right? Or being an artist, whatever your vocation is, your livelihood. It's important to be reflective upon it and making sure it's something that's life-giving for you and fits your giftings, so you could share those giftings with the community, or maybe being a teacher, right? Could be one way make a living. Again, in addition to the ones we've covered, you had right mindfulness. Connected to right mindfulness, you had right meditation. And so again, across, when you look into the textbook, you'll see different forms and practices of meditation mentioned that cut across the three major vehicles in the Buddhist tradition. Okay, so I want to stop there. And what I think I'm going to do is we're going to pick it up next class right here in the middle of this extended lecture on teachings or Dharma in the Buddhist tradition, which is the second gem of the three gems. So one more lecture on Dharma, on teaching, and then after that, we'll wrap up our time in the Buddhist tradition by talking about the Sangha, or the community, the third gem. All right, thank you so much. And I will see you soon. I'll see you next time around. All right, thank you. Take care.